some of you probably aren't familiar with the letter to Titus. It's one of the lesser read letters of Paul. If you're going to skip one, you usually skip Philemon. And if you're going to skip two, you skip Philemon and Titus, usually. Titus is the one that probably gets ignored the most next to Philemon. It's probably one of my favorites. Because I think it applies better to the situation in which we actually find ourselves most of the time in our society than a lot of the other letters. The other letters often need a lot of contextualizing, whereas Titus is a letter written to a group of people living in a culture like ours. It's written to a young man left in charge to pastor in a culture like ours. If you're looking for a context for Titus, imagine a young man asked to go and work among church plants, among young little churches, just little groups of people, really kind of almost Bible studies probably, happening in homes in various small towns around northern Alberta, up in the oil patch, where you kind of got rig workers. It looks a little bit like that We Are Young video by Fun. I don't know if you've seen this thing. When I sing it, it sounds more like We Are Old, I know, but many of you are still young. You may have watched this video if you're familiar with this thing that the kids are doing called YouTube. You may have watched videos on there, and you can watch We Are Young. That it's a bar fight, right? It's the whole thing, and by the end there's pieces of the piano are blowing off, and the drums are exploding. The whole thing kind of tears apart. That's the situation that Titus is left in. He's left in a bar fight. It says in Titus chapter 1 that of the place he's at, the Isle of Crete, that all the people from Crete, all the Cretans, you may have heard that, if you're old like me, as an insult. When I was a kid, people still threw that around as an insult. All the Cretans are lazy, they're stubborn, they're selfish, they're drunks, they're engaged in bar fights. All of them are liars. That's what Paul says. One of their own poets describes them this way, and then he goes on to say, and that testimony, it's true. That's not a very flattering portrayal. He says, one of your own people describes you as a bunch of punks, and guess what? He was right. You are a bunch of punks. That's what he says to Titus. That's where he leaves Titus, in the midst of that fun video. Right in the middle of that, Titus is supposed to be pastoring churches. And so the advice he gives Titus is applicable to that kind of situation. It's not advice for sweet, nice, good Chinese church people, but it's more like the kind of advice that applies to the rough and ready culture we find ourselves in. I actually think that more and more there is no such thing as nice church kids. That more and more we find the confluence of the culture of the church and the culture of the world are closer together than we'd like to admit. And we are struggling with the influence of all of the culture in the church just as much as they are out there. In some ways, I think that's a good thing. Because when they have struggles, we at least can identify them. When they're having problems, we at least know somebody that's had that problem. We're not completely separate. We're not monks living in the desert where we've never seen any problems. We've never hung out with anybody who didn't readily share their food. We've never, ever experienced anyone even thinking about getting drunk. We don't know anybody that would ever even think about that. I actually think sometimes it's healthy to know about the world's problems, not to necessarily experience them all, but to have at least smell the aroma of sin. At least, even if you didn't taste it yourself, and I'm not recommending that, but you should at least be familiar with the smell. There's a great advantage to being familiar with smell. Once upon a time, I didn't know why I detested the smell of Chicago inner city dumpsters so much more than I detested the smell of garbage back home. Nobody likes the smell of garbage. But when I would walk down the alleys in Saskatoon, you'd walk by a big dumpster behind an apartment building, you'd smell the garbage in there, and you'd be like, there was nothing that made you want to get in. There was nothing about that smell that made you want to climb in. But there was nothing about it that made you want to leave that alley right away either. And when I went to Chicago for the first time, I was there in the summer, and you'd walk down the alley and you'd pass some of these dumpsters, and they would make you wish you lived in a different city. They would make you want to go for a swim in Lake Michigan right then, and like just run to the lake and clean yourself, even though you hadn't touched anything or even gotten that close to it. The smell was just horrible. I later found out that that was because there were maggots in those dumpsters. And in Saskatoon, most of the time it's too cold for flies to lay eggs in dumpsters. They don't bother. They pick other places inside homes. And so you wouldn't smell that smell. Well, I'm real glad I didn't climb any of those dumpsters in Chicago. But when somebody told me, well, I know what you're smelling, it's the maggots. Oh, I was kind of glad to have the mystery solved. Why does dumpsters smell so much worse in Chicago than they do in Saskatoon? I was glad for the information. It didn't make me want to experience it, but it was useful, in my mind at least, to know the reason. We live in a society infested with maggots. If you're not aware of it, then I don't know where you're looking. But the fact is, the people around us show every sign that they're going to hell in a handbasket. The society around us is a mess. It's infested with maggots, and it smells rotten. I think it's useful to be familiar with the smell and to know what the cause is. It doesn't make me want to taste it. It doesn't make me want to climb right in and experience it. But I also don't want to be so separate from it that I don't even know what that smell is. That's just me. That's where Titus was left. He was left in the midst of a culture that was a mess. A people that were a mess. They were destroying themselves with their behaviors. They were rotten to the core. And Paul left him there to try to fix it. Have you ever noticed that God is a God who leaves things kind of unfinished? He begins things in great ways, but then leaves them unfinished. If you look at the creation story, this is a great way to see this part of God. You look at the creation story, and there's the formation work of God at work, right? The forming work of God. But everything he creates, he leaves with the job of making more. Right? The birds are supposed to make more birds, and the fish make more fish, and the people are supposed to make more people. The apple trees are supposed to make more apple trees. And everything we see in the created order has a purpose to make more of itself, to finish up the work. The work isn't completed in the Garden of Eden. It started, but the completion is going to happen over generations. The first human couple are told, be fruitful and multiply. Like, have some kids. There's meant to be more than just two of you. That's not the plan. God's plan wasn't just, well, Adam and Eve, they were perfect. What do you need more for? They're good. If we get more, it'll probably get messy. And in fact, exactly what happens. Right? The story goes, but God gave them the clear instruction that it was meant to be finished. And that wasn't done. Jesus, when he leaves, he has a group of 120 people thereabouts who are very committed to him, that are gathered there, waiting for some kind of response from God, praying for God to do something. And God empowers that 120 people to become the church that we know today. That numbers literally over 1 billion people are gathered, worshiping Jesus' name this Sunday morning around the world. That 120 people Jesus had. How's it over 1 billion? Because God meant for us to continue the work. Paul seems to have followed that example, because he starts a few of these little Bible studies around the Isle of Crete, and then he leaves. And he leaves Titus there, and he says, finish that up for me, would you? Just go, man, you've got like 4 Bible studies happening in 4 different homes in 4 different towns. Save the Isle of Crete for me. Basically, it's done. clean up the little bits. I mean, he leaves him quite a bit of the work. In fact, he doesn't actually expect Titus to finish up. When we get to the end of Titus, what we're going to find is that he's going to get replaced eventually. Because he knows Titus too will get tired and will want a break. And it's not up to Titus to finish the work either. But God starts great things but expects us to finish up. So what does this all have to do with the passage we read in Titus? I think that that's part of the plan of how we finish up. This is instruction on how we do it. I'm going to do something not very Chinese church this morning. I'm going to ask you guys to participate a little bit in the sermon. I know that's not very Chinese church, but they're pretty simple questions, so I'm hoping you're going to be willing to play along with it. It's not very normal. If you're between the ages of, or if you're under the age of 25, would you please stand up? Now, for those of you that are still sitting, look around this room. Right? Over half of the people, I'm pretty sure I'm counting correctly, are standing right now. When you want to know, first of all, how to impact the younger generation, well, first of all, they're here. We don't have to go looking for them. And the people that are going to be able to impact them, that are going to be the most natural influencers of the culture at large, are right here in our midst. You can go ahead and sit down. Right? That the young people that need instruction are right here with us. And if you want to impact their schools and for a few of them, their workplaces, for a few of the older ones, if you want to impact those places, impact these people, then impact those places. But the fact is, I'm going to ask you guys one more question. Would you stand back up if you stand back up only if you have an older person in your life who you know very intentionally works to make you a more mature Christian, works very hard to disciple you. Do you get my point? The fact is, I mean, there's some instruction in here for how older men and older women are supposed to live. I'm not going to talk about that a lot because the older men and the older women in this church, by my estimation, from what I can see of your lives, you already do that stuff. You're supposed to not be drunks. You're supposed to be okay with your money. You're supposed to be decent people, that people could look to you and respect the basic details of your life, like you pay your bills and you don't live on the street and you don't beat your spouse and you don't kick the dog every time you take out the garbage and you're not a drunk. Well, I think most of you get all that stuff right away. The fact is, the part that we fail in this church, but we fail in the North American church. This isn't exclusive to this church. It's not exclusive to the Chinese church. It's not exclusive to the Edmonton church. It is at least universal in my experience across the North American church. We are not doing a good job telling the young people how they're supposed to live their lives. And if we don't do a good job telling young people how they're supposed to live their lives, someone else will do it for us. And some of the voices that they're exposed to every day, because of things like YouTube and the internet, some of those voices aren't very helpful. They're not going to tell them what it looks like to be a mature Christian. They're not going to tell them why people go to church. They're not going to, and they don't automatically understand that. Just because you make them go to church for 15 years doesn't mean that they understand why they're supposed to go to church. Just because you give faithfully to the church doesn't automatically mean they know that they're supposed to do that one day. And all across North America, we mess this up all the time. But when I look at the problem, I don't see it as a problem. Man, the young people today just don't understand. They just don't think hard enough. They're not dedicated enough. They're not willing enough. That's not where I see the problem. I think people that are a couple of steps ahead have stopped looking behind them to make sure someone's following. Have stopped looking behind them to make sure they're discipling somebody. Have stopped making sure somebody teaches them this stuff. And most of the young people have nobody teaching. And then we're surprised that they don't all turn out to be black belts. Nobody teaches them the katas. Nobody works through the basic moves. Nobody gives them the pattern of discipline on how to exercise. But then we're surprised they don't all turn out to be Bruce Lee. I don't understand. Like, didn't they see me punching the punching bag? Oh, well, no, I never actually showed them how to punch the punch. But they should have just picked it up by watching the movie. No, it never worked that way. Nobody ever learned anything. No one ever learned anything without a teacher. No one ever became better at anything without intentional instruction. I don't know if you think I'm wrong, go ahead and figure out how I'm wrong. But I'm pretty sure nobody ever got better at anything without intentional instruction. Last weekend when the New Year's celebration was happening, I tried to make Hargal based on a YouTube video. Even that's intentional instruction. But I didn't understand the importance of this little pop-up bubble that popped up about halfway through the video. It popped up, and there's a little bubble that popped up on the screen, and it said, when she was mixing in the flour, it said, "I use non-glutinous wheat flour." And I'm like, I don't even know what that means. I've never heard of non-glutinous wheat flour. I didn't see that in the grocery store. And I'm like, it says flour in the ingredients list. I'm using flour. I have that. But several people, when they tasted it, were like, the filling's okay, the dough's all wrong. Something's wrong with the dough. And then one of the older Chinese ladies actually said, "No, you need to go to the Chinese grocery store and you need to buy this stuff called wheat starch." And I'm like non-glutinous wheat flour? She's like, "Yeah, that's the right stuff." And it has a picture of a Hargal on the front. Like, you'll know you've got the right stuff. Because there's actually a picture of the dumpling right on the front of the bag. You'll know it's the right stuff. Oh, well, that'll be very helpful for next time I try to make those. Maybe next year on New Year's I'll try again. And it'll turn out even better. They were pretty good for a first attempt, but they'll be better. Because somebody had the intent, well, several people actually, intentionally took me aside and taught me better, how to do better next time. And hopefully they'll be better next time because people tried to teach me how to do it better next time. Nobody got better at anything without somebody trying to teach me. And the young people in this church and in the North American church desperately need people who are a couple of steps ahead of them to look back and go, "So how can we help bring you along? How can we help teach you how to do this?" The older men, and I know if you're 25 or 26 or 27, you're probably not very excited about being called an older man. And if you're a woman, you're probably even less excited about being called an older man. But the fact is, in this congregation, in this church, in this context, you're going to have to be old enough. And you already know some things. If you're still here, you already know some things, you've read some things, you've done some, you know some of the things that helped get you to the point of spiritual maturity you're at right now. And you can teach those. And what I found, the great news is, when you're teaching those, that's a great inspiration to keep learning new things. Because you run out of things to teach the younger person, and so then you're like, I need to go learn some new things. And that's great inspiration for you to keep growing, for you to keep developing. You know, a lot of people in these verses, just one little comment, a lot of people in these verses get pretty hung up about some of what it says about the role of women right at the end. And I don't want to leave that untouched since I ultimately can't do this. There's a bunch of stuff in here about teaching the young women to be basically good housewives in a fairly traditional kind of role. And a lot of people make a very big deal when preaching on this passage about those verses. This is what Christian families are supposed to look like. And this is the order. You know, that those same people will read the very next verse, the one we didn't read. If you look down to verse 9 in Titus chapter 2, the very next verse talks about slaves. And they'll read that verse and they'll say, well, that was for that time. And if you're going to properly apply slaves, it probably talks about how we should think about our employers. And they put a different context on it. They say, we should be good employees. We should be dedicated. We should work hard even when our employer, even when the boss isn't looking. We should try to do our job with excellence. That's what that means. Actually, I agree with it. I agree that's what the part about slaves, that's how it should be applied. Because what is the passage about? It's about being exemplary people in the culture in which you're in. I think that the instructions about housewives and women are instructing the women on how to be exemplary women in the culture that they're in. And I think that the instruction continues to apply, that we should, our women and our men, you notice there's lots of instruction to men in there too, but the instruction to women is about being exemplary women in the culture that they're in. And the instruction continues to be for young women and older women to be exemplary women in the culture that they're in. And if that culture continues to convince you to be a good housewife as how to be an exemplary, then you should be a good housewife. But when you're in a culture where that's not the only option for how to be an exemplary woman, I think that it is not necessarily the only option for a Christian woman either. Does that make any sense? So, if we're in a culture where there's more than one option on how to be a good woman. There are options on how to be a woman of ill repute, how to be a woman that people look down on, but there's more than one option. You can be a housewife and be exemplary in our society. But you can be a young professional and be exemplary in our society. Women can become doctors and lawyers and politicians and be exemplary in our society. I think all of those options are open to Christian women. That this passage doesn't teach that the role of women is to stay home and take care of the kids. And if they're not doing that, they're somehow failing as Christian women. It also doesn't mean that you can't do that. It just means that what this is teaching, what this has always been teaching, I think, is that we are supposed to be people who, when the world looks at us, and look carefully at the passage and try to prove me wrong, when the world teaches us, when the world looks at us, when the world looks at us, they should see people that they can look up to. Men and women. That our lives should be exemplary. Now that's not enough. As I've been telling you, we also need to be opening our mouths. We can't just count on, I'm a nice person, and everyone around me knows I'm a nice person, and they see me go to church, so they'll all know that if they want to be nice people, they need to go to church too. No, I don't think it works that way. But they should be able to look at our lives and go, I like what I see there. I don't see a lot there that I need to fix. Or that, in fact, it looks like they can help me fix some of the stuff in my life. They ought to see that. They ought to look at the stuff you do and go, good for you. Last night I went on a walk with a whole bunch of people. Most of them were Christians. We were raising money for a Hope Mission. And we walked around the downtown. And because there were several hundred of us all wearing matching yellow toques, people sort of noticed, like, hey, what's going on? Why are there 400 people all walking that direction in one pack, all wearing yellow toques? So I told them, well, it's Yellow Hat Day. You didn't get the memo? And they, no, it's not Yellow Hat Day, don't worry. And I explained to them that we were raising money for Hope Mission. All the people went, that's nice. That's a good thing we're doing. One guy even gave me some money, which I used to buy. No, I gave it to the Hope Mission. The people, it's not that you have to be absolutely perfect in everything, but the people, when they look at the details of your life, they ought to go, oh, you're doing good stuff. And I think that that's completely possible. For men, for women, and we need, the young men and women in this congregation need, us who are older, to take the opportunity to teach them means to be an exemplary person. In a society that will give them very different examples. We'll tell them, oh, it's fine, go to a bar fight, smash a bottle over someone's head. It's fun, and you're young, and that's what young people do. They smash beer bottles on each other's head. I had a friend who did that. He was a very promising running back for the Saskatoon Hilltops. He was looking forward to a professional football career. He was engaged to a beautiful young woman, a friend of mine. He went and he had a problem. He liked to get drunk a little bit too much. And when he got drunk, he was really a miserable person. Because he was 5'6", and he always wanted to be 6'6". And when he was drunk, he sort of convinced himself that maybe he was. And when he was 6'6", he was always also bulletproof. Like he thought and he was a big, strong guy. He worked out really, really hard. He could lift more weight than I could, even though I was quite a bit bigger than him, quite a bit heavier. I was a lineman, and this running back could bench press more than I could. And more than most of the linemen on the team. He was very, very fit and worked very hard. But one night, Kirby got drunk, and a bouncer tried to throw him out of the bar because he kind of grabbed this girl, and another guy had started to fight, and he knocked that guy down. And so the bouncers grabbed him, and he grabbed a beer bottle off a table and smashed it over the bouncer's head. The bouncer was blind after that, one eye, because broken glass went into his eye and wrecked his eye. Kirby went to jail. And the girl he was engaged to decided, he kind of, when he gets drunk, sometimes he pushes me around too, and I don't really like it, and she decided to break up with him at that point, called off for a wedding. And he spent 6 months in jail. By the time he got out of jail, none of the junior football programs wanted him on the team anymore. He'd also not had an opportunity to work out in the same sorts of ways that he had while he was in prison, and so he wasn't in the same shape anymore. And last time I saw him, he was working for the city, shoveling asphalt. He had a job. He was not homeless. He was trying to get his life together, but his football dream was over, his engagement was over, his life was over, because nobody had ever told Kirby, maybe that's not the best way to spend every weekend. I hope that we will continue to hold up better examples for our young people. And the older folks in this church, who just happen to be quite conveniently sort of split to this side, you are the ones